Neighbor traps dog in a cage, then karma hits back in a shocking way. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. It was a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, where rows of houses sat cozily along tree-lined streets. The kind of place where people waved to each other while walking their dogs or tending their gardens. But not all the neighbors were friendly. Among the idyllic setting, there was one house that stood out, not for its charm, but for the way it exuded an air of coldness. This house belonged to Mr. Grayson, an elderly man with a perpetual scowl etched onto his face. He didn't talk much, didn't like visitors, and most of all, didn't like animals. Next door lived Maria, a young woman in her late 20s, her baby bump gently visible under her loose sweater as she sat on her front porch with a book. By her side lay Cooper, her loyal and affectionate dog. Cooper was a mix of breeds, with floppy ears and warm brown eyes that seemed to radiate kindness. He was more than just a pet to Maria. He was her protector, her companion, and in some ways her family. Maria had moved into the neighborhood a year ago, looking for a fresh start. She was expecting her first child, and while she didn't have much in terms of family nearby, Cooper had been with her every step of the way. Whether it was accompanying her on her morning walks or curling up by her feet when she felt lonely, Cooper had a way of making Maria feel safe and loved. But Mr. Grayson didn't share Maria's affection for Cooper. From the moment Maria had moved in, he had complained incessantly about the dog. "It barks too much," he'd yell over the fence, even when Cooper was silent. "It's digging up my yard," he'd accuse, despite the fact that Cooper never left Maria's side. No matter what Maria said or did, it seemed Mr. Grayson had made it his mission to dislike the dog, and by extension, Maria. One sunny morning, Maria sat on her porch, stroking Cooper's fur while sipping tea. The neighborhood was alive with activity, children riding bikes, a mail carrier making his rounds, and the distant hum of lawnmowers. Maria smiled, feeling a sense of peace as she imagined the future she was building for her child. But her moment of calm was interrupted by the familiar gruff voice of Mr. Grayson. "Keep that mud under control," he barked from his yard, glaring at Maria through the slats of his fence. Maria sighed, keeping her tone polite. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Grayson." Cooper hasn't even left the porch. "I don't care," he snapped. "It's only a matter of time before it causes trouble." Maria held her breath, willing herself to stay calm. She had tried being friendly, tried explaining that Cooper was well-trained, but it was clear Mr. Grayson had made up his mind. "Cooper is a good dog," she said gently. "He's never caused any problems." Mr. Grayson muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he retreated into his house. Maria watched him go, her heart sinking. She hated the tension between them, but more than that, she worried about Cooper. Mr. Grayson's hostility wasn't just verbal. It was the kind that simmered and brewed, the kind that could lead to something worse. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between Maria and Mr. Grayson only grew. Cooper remained his usual happy self, blissfully unaware of the animosity directed his way. But Maria couldn't ignore the little signs, the way Mr. Grayson glared at Cooper when he thought no one was looking, the way he grumbled under his breath whenever he passed by. One afternoon, Maria returned home from a doctor's appointment to find a note pinned to her door. The handwriting was shaky and scrawled, but the message was clear: "Keep your dog quiet or else." Her heart sank as she read the words. She glanced at Cooper, who wagged his tail obliviously, his eyes full of trust. Maria clenched the note in her hand, anger and fear bubbling up inside her. She had done everything she could to keep the peace, but this was too much. She decided to confront Mr. Grayson directly. With a note in hand, she marched over to his front door and knocked firmly. It took a moment, but eventually the door creaked open, revealing Mr. Grayson's scowling face. "What do you want?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Maria held up the note. "Did you leave this on my door?" Mr. Grayson's eyes flicked to the note, then back to Maria. "Maybe I did," he said gruffly. "That dog of yours is a menace." "Cooper is not a menace," Maria said, her voice steady despite the anger in her chest. "He's never done anything to you or your property. This note is uncalled for." Mr. Grayson crossed his arms, his gaze hard. "I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never had to deal with a dog like that. Barking, digging, it's only a matter of time before it bites someone." Maria's fists clenched at her sides. "Cooper has never bitten anyone. He's a kind, gentle dog. You're making assumptions without any evidence." "Maybe so," Mr. Grayson said, his tone dismissive, "but I'll be keeping an eye on him." With that, he closed the door, leaving Maria standing on the porch, her heart pounding with frustration. She returned home, her mind racing. She couldn't understand why Mr. Grayson was so intent on causing trouble. Cooper had never done anything to deserve such hostility. That night, Maria struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Grayson's threat was more than just empty words. She got up and checked on Cooper, who was curled up on his bed in the living room. He looked up at her sleepily, his tail wagging at the sight of her. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, kneeling down to stroke his fur. "I'll keep you safe." But even as she said the words, a nagging fear tugged at her. She didn't know what Mr. Grayson was capable of, and the thought of Cooper being hurt or taken away was almost too much to bear. The following morning, Maria woke to an eerie silence. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, chirping birds, distant car engines, were absent. She stepped outside, a chill running down her spine as she realized something was wrong. "Cooper," she called, her voice tinged with worry. "Come here, boy." There was no response. Panic set in as she searched the yard, her heart pounding. Cooper was always by her side. He never wandered off. She checked the gate, which was securely latched, and called his name again, her voice growing louder. "Cooper." Still nothing. Tears pricked her eyes as the fear she had been suppressing came rushing to the surface. She ran to Mr. Grayson's house, banging on the door with desperation. "Mr. Grayson," she yelled. "Have you seen Cooper?" The door opened slowly, and Mr. Grayson appeared, his expression unreadable. "What's all this noise about?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "Cooper's gone," Maria said, her voice shaking. "I can't find him anywhere." "Do you know anything about this?" Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Why would I know anything about your dog?" "Because you've been threatening him." Maria shot back, her anger breaking through her fear. "If you've done anything to him." "Watch your tone," Mr. Grayson interrupted, his voice cold. "I don't have time for this nonsense." He closed the door before Maria could say another word, leaving her standing on the porch, tears streaming down her face. She turned and walked back home, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Where was Cooper? And what had Mr. Grayson done? Maria spent the entire morning searching for Cooper. She wandered the neighborhood, calling his name and checking every corner where he might have gone. Her growing belly slowed her down, but she refused to give up. She asked neighbors if they had seen him, knocking on doors with a mixture of hope and desperation. Some were kind, offering to help her look. Others simply shrugged, shaking their heads as they said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. By noon, Maria's fear turned into dread. Cooper had never run away before, and he wasn't the kind of dog to wander far from home. Something wasn't right, and deep down, Maria knew it. She sat on her porch, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. She considered calling the local animal control or even the police, but what would she say? That she suspected her neighbor had done something to her dog? Without proof, it sounded ridiculous. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Grayson was involved. As she sat there, lost in thought, a voice broke through her haze. "Maria?" It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She approached with a concerned expression, cane tapping softly against the pavement. "Is everything all right, dear? You look upset." Maria stood up quickly, wiping at her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, have you seen Cooper?" "He's gone. I've looked everywhere, and I can't find him." Mrs. Henderson frowned, shaking her head. "No, I haven't. But I did hear something strange this morning. I was watering my plants, and I thought I heard a dog whining. It sounded like it was coming from Mr. Grayson's backyard." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "His backyard? Are you sure?" "I think so," Mrs. Henderson said. "I didn't see anything, but it was faint, like the dog was trapped or hurt." That was all Maria needed to hear. Without another word, she marched toward Mr. Grayson's house, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. She reached his backyard fence and peered over it. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just a patchy lawn, a few old chairs, and a rusted barbecue grill. But then, in the far corner, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. A large metal cage sat near the edge of the fence, its door padlocked shut. Inside was Cooper, his brown eyes wide with fear. He was lying on his side, his ears flattened against his head, and his tail curled tightly around him. The sight of him trapped like that made Maria's stomach churn. "Cooper," she called, her voice breaking. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he let out a soft whine. He tried to stand but seemed too weak, his movements sluggish. Maria's heart broke as she realized how long he must have been in there, without food or water. She banged on Mr. Grayson's back door with all her strength. "Mr. Grayson," she shouted, "open this door right now." It took a few moments, but eventually the door creaked open. Mr. Grayson appeared, his face twisted into a scowl. "What is all this racket about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Maria snapped, pointing toward the cage. "You trapped my dog in your backyard. Let him out right now." Mr. Grayson didn't even flinch. "That mutt's been digging up my yard," he said coldly. "I warned you, didn't I? If you couldn't control it, I'd take care of it myself." Maria stared at him in disbelief. "Take care of it? You kidnapped my dog. Do you have any idea how cruel that is? He's been out here, suffering because of you." "He deserves it," Mr. Grayson said, crossing his arms. "Maybe next time you'll learn to keep your pet where it belongs." Fury bubbled up inside Maria, and she clenched her fists to keep from shouting. "I'm giving you one chance," she said through gritted teeth. "Let him out now, or I'll call the police." Mr. Grayson snorted. "Go ahead. Call them. I'd love to see what they'll do. It's your word against mine." Maria's jaw tightened, but she knew he was right. Without proof that Cooper hadn't done any damage, the authorities might not take her side. But she wasn't going to let Mr. Grayson win. She pulled out her phone and snapped several pictures of the cage and Cooper inside it, making sure to capture every angle. "This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm getting my dog back, and you're going to regret this." She stormed back to her house, her mind racing with plans. She couldn't let this slide, not just for Cooper's sake, but for her own peace of mind. Mr. Grayson had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Maria spent the rest of the day gathering evidence. She spoke to Mrs. Henderson, who agreed to back her up if she needed to report the incident. She also called a local animal rights group, explaining the situation and asking for advice. They were horrified by what had happened and offered to help her take legal action if necessary. That evening, Maria returned to Mr. Grayson's house with a police officer in tow. The officer, a middle-aged man with a kind face, listened patiently as Maria explained the situation. When they reached the backyard, the officer frowned at the sight of the cage. "Mr. Grayson," the officer said, knocking firmly on the back door. "We need to have a word." Mr. Grayson opened the door, his expression sour. "What now?" he grumbled. "Is this your cage?" the officer asked, gesturing toward it. "It is," Mr. Grayson replied. "And that dog's been causing problems. I had every right to keep it off my property." The officer's brow furrowed. "Mr. Grayson, trapping someone else's pet is illegal. You can't just take matters into your own hands like this." "It's not my fault she can't control her dog," Mr. Grayson snapped. "I warned her, and she didn't listen." "That doesn't give you the right to harm the animal," the officer said firmly. "You'll need to release the dog immediately, or you'll be facing charges for animal cruelty." Mr. Grayson's face turned red, but he didn't argue further. With a muttered curse, he retrieved the key to the padlock and opened the cage. Cooper stumbled out, his legs shaky but his tail wagging as he limped toward Maria. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him as tears streamed down her face. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "You're safe now." The officer issued Mr. Grayson a citation and warned him that further actions against Cooper or Maria would result in harsher penalties. As they left, Maria felt a wave of relief, but also a lingering sense of unease. She didn't trust Mr. Grayson to leave them alone, and she knew she'd have to stay vigilant. Back at home, Maria gave Cooper food and water, watching as he regained his strength. Despite everything he had been through, his eyes still shone with trust and love. It amazed her how resilient he was, even in the face of cruelty. "You're stronger than I am," she said softly, stroking his fur. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As she sat with him, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. She had won this battle, but the war with Mr. Grayson was far from over. The days that followed were quiet, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time she looked out the window and saw Mr. Grayson's house, her stomach churned. She couldn't forget the cold indifference in his voice or the way he had trapped Cooper without remorse. She knew he wasn't the type to let things go, and the thought of what he might do next kept her on edge. Cooper, on the other hand, seemed to have put the ordeal behind him. He wagged his tail whenever Maria entered the room, following her around the house like a shadow. Despite his ordeal, his trust in her and his joyful spirit remained unshaken. Maria admired his resilience, but it also broke her heart to think about how much he had suffered because of Mr. Grayson's cruelty. One afternoon, as Maria was sitting on her porch with Cooper lying at her feet, she noticed something unusual. Mr. Grayson was standing in his yard, staring at her. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, his arms crossed and his eyes locked on her. The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. Maria decided to ignore him, focusing instead on stroking Cooper's fur. But as the days went by, she realized this wasn't a one-time occurrence. Every morning when she took Cooper out for a walk, every evening when she watered her garden, she would catch Mr. Grayson watching her from his yard. He never spoke, but his presence was enough to make her feel uneasy. One night, Maria woke to the sound of rustling outside. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and crept to the window. Peering through the curtains, she saw a figure moving in the shadows near her fence. It was too dark to make out the person's face, but the shape and size of the figure were unmistakable. It was Mr. Grayson. Maria's hands trembled as she dialed the police. "There's someone in my yard," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I think it's my neighbor. He's been harassing me and my dog." The dispatcher assured her that an officer was on the way. Maria stayed by the window, watching as the figure moved closer to the house. Cooper, sensing her fear, let out a low growl and stood protectively by her side. She stroked his head, trying to calm both him and herself. By the time the police arrived, the figure had disappeared. The officer searched the yard but found no sign of anyone. "Are you sure it was your neighbor?" he asked. Maria nodded. "I'm certain. He's been watching me for days, and he's already gone after my dog once. I'm scared he's going to do something worse." The officer took her statement and promised to keep an eye on the situation. But as he drove away, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Grayson wasn't done with her yet. The following morning, Maria decided she had had enough. She couldn't live in fear any longer. She needed to take action, not just for her own sake, but for Cooper's as well. She reached out to the local animal rights group she had spoken to before, explaining the latest incident. They offered to connect her with a lawyer who could help her file a restraining order against Mr. Grayson. Maria hesitated. She didn't want to escalate the situation further, but she also couldn't ignore the danger Mr. Grayson posed. After a long conversation with the lawyer, she decided to move forward with the restraining order. It was a difficult decision, but she knew it was the right one. Meanwhile, Maria's neighbors began to take notice of what was happening. Mrs. Henderson, who had always been kind to Maria, started stopping by more often to check on her. "You're so brave, dear," she said one afternoon as they sat on the porch together. "I know how difficult it must be to stand up to him, but you're doing the right thing." Others in the neighborhood began to offer their support as well. One neighbor volunteered to install security cameras around Maria's house, while another offered to help watch Cooper whenever Maria needed to run errands. The outpouring of kindness gave Maria hope and reminded her that she wasn't alone. As the weeks went by, the tension between Maria and Mr. Grayson reached a boiling point. He stopped trying to hide his hostility, yelling insults at Maria whenever he saw her. "You're ruining this neighborhood," he shouted one morning as she walked Cooper past his house. "You and that mutt don't belong here." Maria kept her head high, refusing to let his words get to her. She had learned to find strength in the support of her neighbors and the bond she shared with Cooper. But she also knew that Mr. Grayson's anger wasn't just going to disappear. He was a man consumed by bitterness, and she could only hope that the restraining order would keep him at bay. One evening, Maria received a call from the lawyer handling her case. "Good news," the lawyer said. "The restraining order has been approved. Mr. Grayson is legally required to stay away from you and your property. If he violates the order, he could face serious consequences." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax. She knew the restraining order wouldn't erase the pain and fear she had experienced, but it was a step toward reclaiming her peace of mind. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Maria was sitting on her porch with Cooper when she noticed a group of people gathered in front of Mr. Grayson's house. Curious, she walked over to see what was going on. To her surprise, she saw animal control officers loading a cage into their truck. Inside the cage was a large, aggressive-looking dog that Maria had never seen before. One of the officers noticed Maria and approached her. "Are you the woman who filed a complaint against Mr. Grayson?" he asked. "Yes," Maria replied, confused. "Why?" "We received an anonymous tip that Mr. Grayson was keeping a dangerous dog on his property," the officer explained. "When we investigated, we found this dog chained up in his backyard without proper shelter or care. It's clear he's been mistreating animals." Maria's eyes widened as the officer's words sank in. She had always known Mr. Grayson was cruel, but she hadn't realized the extent of his behavior. The thought of another animal suffering at his hands filled her with anger and sadness. As the officers drove away, Maria noticed Mr. Grayson standing on his porch, his face pale with rage. For the first time, he looked powerless, a man who had lost the control he had so desperately clung to. Maria met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes said it all. This was justice. Back at home, Maria knelt down beside Cooper, wrapping her arms around him. "It's over," she whispered. "We're safe now." Cooper licked her face, his tail wagging as if he understood. For the first time in weeks, Maria felt a sense of peace. She had stood up to Mr. Grayson, protected Cooper, and shown the neighborhood that cruelty would not be tolerated. As the sun set over the quiet street, Maria sat on her porch with Cooper by her side, her hand resting on her growing belly. She thought about the future, the life she was building for her child, the lessons she would teach them about kindness and courage. And she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same strength that had carried her through this ordeal. With Mr. Grayson gone, Maria felt a new sense of peace in her home and her neighborhood. It was as though a dark cloud had lifted, allowing sunlight to pour in. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere more welcoming. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves now greeted each other warmly, and there was a growing sense of community that hadn't existed before. Maria was at the heart of it all, though she didn't see herself as a leader. She was simply someone who had done what needed to be done. Cooper adjusted well to the changes, as if he understood that the danger had passed. His energy returned fully, and he became more playful and affectionate than ever. He followed Maria everywhere, his wagging tail and joyful demeanor a constant reminder of how much love he brought into her life. Maria often found herself reflecting on how different things could have been if she hadn't found him years ago as a stray. He had been her companion through thick and thin, and now, with her son in the picture, their bond only deepened. Her baby boy, whom she named Ethan, quickly grew attached to Cooper. Despite being just a few weeks old, Ethan seemed to light up whenever Cooper was nearby. The dog, in turn, was gentle and protective, lying beside Ethan's crib as though guarding him from the world. Maria often caught herself smiling at the sight, her heart swelling with gratitude for the little family they had built. One morning, as Maria was preparing breakfast, she noticed Cooper sitting by the front door, his ears perked up and his tail wagging slightly. He had been doing this more often lately, almost as though he were expecting someone. Maria walked over and knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. "Are you waiting for someone?" Cooper let out a soft whine, his eyes fixed on the door. Maria couldn't help but feel a pang of curiosity. She opened the door and stepped outside, looking around. The street was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. But then she saw it, a small box sitting on her porch, tied with a bright blue ribbon. Frowning, Maria picked up the box and brought it inside. Cooper followed closely, sniffing at it with interest. She set it on the kitchen table and carefully untied the ribbon, lifting the lid to reveal its contents. Inside was a handwritten note resting on top of a bundle of small items. Maria picked up the note and read it aloud. "Dear Maria, I owe you an apology. I know I've caused you a lot of pain, and I'll never be able to make up for it. But I wanted to say thank you for standing up for what's right, for protecting your dog, and for showing me the kind of person I should have been. I've left the neighborhood, but I wanted to leave you with something to remember that even people like me can change. I hope you'll accept this as a small gesture of my regret. Sincerely, James Grayson." Maria stared at the note, her emotions a mixture of shock and disbelief. She hadn't expected this, not from Mr. Grayson. She glanced at the items in the box: a new leash and collar for Cooper, a small bag of gourmet dog treats, and a framed photo of what appeared to be a younger Mr. Grayson with a dog of his own. The dog in the photo was a golden retriever, its fur shining in the sunlight as it sat beside a smiling James Grayson. Maria sat down, the note still in her hand. She hadn't thought it possible for Mr. Grayson to change, but the letter and the photo told a different story. She wondered about the dog in the picture. Had it been the source of his bitterness? Had he lost it somehow and, in his grief, turned his pain outward? The question swirled in her mind, but one thing was clear: even the hardest hearts could soften. Cooper sniffed at the box, his tail wagging as he nudged the bag of treats with his nose. Maria smiled and opened the bag, giving him one of the treats. "Looks like you've got a fan," she said, scratching behind his ears. Who would have thought? The gesture didn't erase the pain Mr. Grayson had caused, but it offered something Maria hadn't expected: closure. For the first time, she felt she could let go of the anger she had been holding onto. She folded the note carefully and placed it in a drawer, deciding to keep it as a reminder that even small acts of kindness could make a difference. As the months passed, Maria continued to find joy in the little moments of her daily life. Ethan grew quickly, his laughter filling the house as he learned to crawl and explore his surroundings. Cooper was his constant companion, always nearby to nuzzle him or wag his tail in encouragement. One afternoon, as Maria was sitting in the backyard watching Ethan play with Cooper, she noticed Mrs. Henderson walking over with a man in tow. The man was in his late 30s, with a friendly smile and a small dog trotting beside him. Maria stood up to greet them, curious about the unexpected visit. "Maria, this is my nephew Daniel," Mrs. Henderson said, her smile warm. "He just moved to the area and wanted to meet you. He's heard a lot about you and Cooper." Daniel extended his hand, and Maria shook it, her curiosity growing. "It's nice to meet you," she said. "What brings you to the neighborhood?" "I'm starting a new job at the animal shelter," Daniel explained. "Aunt Margaret told me about everything you've done for Cooper and the community, and I just wanted to say thank you. People like you make a real difference." Maria felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I didn't do anything special," she said modestly. "I just wanted to protect my dog." "Well, it sounds like you did a lot more than that," Daniel said, glancing at Cooper. "And I'd love to get involved in whatever you're doing. The shelter's always looking for volunteers if you're interested." Maria's eyes lit up. She had been looking for a way to give back, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. "I'd love that," she said. "And I think Cooper would too." Over the next few weeks, Maria and Daniel began working together at the shelter, organizing adoption events and raising awareness about animal welfare. Cooper quickly became a favorite among the staff and visitors, his gentle nature and playful energy making him the perfect ambassador for the cause. Ethan often joined him, giggling as he played with the animals. Watching her son interact with the dogs and cats, Maria felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known was possible. She was building a life filled with love and purpose, and she knew it was all thanks to the bond she had with Cooper. One evening, as Maria and Daniel were packing up after an event, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Maria, you've got a gift. The way you connect with people and animals, it's special. Have you ever thought about starting your own organization?" Maria laughed softly. "Me? Running an organization? I don't think I'm cut out for that." "I'm serious," Daniel said, his tone earnest. "You've already done so much on your own. Imagine what you could do with a team of people supporting you." Maria considered his words, the idea sparking a flicker of excitement in her chest. She had always thought of herself as just a regular person, someone doing her best to get by. But maybe Daniel was right. Maybe she could do more. That night, as Maria lay in bed with Ethan sleeping peacefully beside her and Cooper curled up at her feet, she thought about the future. She didn't know what it would hold, but she felt ready to face it with courage and determination. She had already overcome so much, and she knew she could handle whatever challenges came her way. Looking down at Cooper, she smiled and whispered, "Thank you, boy, for everything." Cooper wagged his tail in response, his eyes filled with the unspoken love that only a dog could convey. And in that moment, Maria knew that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. Maria spent the next few days mulling over Daniel's suggestion. The idea of starting her own organization both excited and intimidated her. She had no experience running anything of the sort, but the thought of helping animals on a larger scale filled her with a sense of purpose. Every time she looked at Cooper, she was reminded of how much love and joy he had brought into her life, and how many other animals deserved the same chance. One evening, Maria sat down at her kitchen table with a notebook and pen, determined to start planning. She wrote down ideas for what her organization could do: rescuing stray animals, promoting adoption, offering low-cost veterinary services, and educating the community about responsible pet ownership. As the list grew longer, so did her excitement. She could see the potential, the lives she could change, not just for the animals but for the people who would welcome them into their homes. The next morning, Maria called Daniel and shared her ideas. "I think I'm going to do it," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and nervousness. "I want to start an organization." Daniel's enthusiasm was infectious. "That's amazing, Maria. I'll help you every step of the way. We can start small. Maybe hold a fundraiser or an adoption event to get the word out." Maria felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel. I don't think I could do this without you." Over the next few weeks, Maria and Daniel threw themselves into the project. They reached out to local businesses for sponsorships, created flyers and social media pages, and held meetings with other animal lovers in the community. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were eager to support the cause, donating money, supplies, and their time. Their first event was a community adoption fair held at the park. Maria was nervous as she set up the booths, unsure of how many people would show up. But as the day went on, the park filled with families, all eager to meet the animals. By the end of the day, nearly every dog and cat had found a home. Maria couldn't stop smiling as she watched the last family walk away, a newly adopted puppy in their arms. She turned to Daniel, her eyes shining with happiness. "We did it," she said. "We actually did it." Daniel grinned. This is just the beginning. As the organization grew, so did Maria's confidence. She learned how to manage budgets, coordinate volunteers, and plan events. She even started giving talks at schools and community centers, sharing her story and teaching others about the importance of kindness toward animals. Cooper often accompanied her, his presence a comforting reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place. Ethan grew up surrounded by animals, his days filled with laughter and love. He inherited his mother's compassion, always eager to help with the animals or comfort a nervous dog at an adoption event. Maria often marveled at how much he resembled Cooper in spirit, gentle, loyal, and full of love. One day, as Maria was cleaning up after an event, she noticed a little girl sitting quietly by one of the booths. The girl looked shy and nervous, her eyes darting around as if she wasn't sure where to go. Maria approached her with a warm smile. "Hi there," she said softly. "Are you looking for someone?" The girl shook her head. "No, I wanted to see the dogs," she said hesitantly. "But my mom says we can't have one. She says it's too much work." Maria knelt down beside her, keeping her tone gentle. "Taking care of a dog is a big responsibility," she agreed. "But even if you can't have one right now, you can still help them. Would you like to meet Cooper? He's my dog, and he loves making new friends." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really? I can meet him." Maria nodded and called Cooper over. The dog trotted over, his tail wagging as he approached the girl. She reached out hesitantly, then smiled as Cooper licked her hand. "He's so nice," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Maria smiled. "He's the best," she said. "And you know what? Helping animals doesn't always mean taking them home. You can volunteer at a shelter or help spread the word about adoption. Every little bit makes a difference." The girl looked thoughtful, then nodded. "I want to help," she said firmly. "Maybe one day I can have a dog like Cooper." Maria's heart swelled with pride. She knew that moments like these were why she had started the organization, not just to save animals, but to inspire others to make a difference. Years passed, and Maria's organization became a cornerstone of the community. They had expanded their services, offering everything from spay and neuter clinics to pet therapy programs for hospitals and nursing homes. Cooper, now a bit older and grayer, was still by her side, his loyalty unwavering. Ethan, now a teenager, had become an active part of the organization. He had a natural way with animals, his gentle demeanor putting even the most nervous dogs at ease. Maria often watched him with a sense of awe, marveling at how much he had grown and how deeply he cared for the cause they had built together. One day, as Maria and Ethan were preparing for an adoption event, Ethan turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, Do you ever think about how all of this started? He asked. Maria smiled, her eyes softening. I think about it all the time, she said. It all started with Cooper. Ethan nodded. He's more than just a dog, isn't he? He's family, Maria said simply. And he's taught me more about love and loyalty than I ever thought possible. As the adoption event got underway, Maria took a moment to step back and watch. The park was bustling with activity, families meeting animals, volunteers guiding visitors, and children laughing as they played with the dogs. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled her with a profound sense of gratitude. Cooper sat beside her, his tail wagging as he watched the scene unfold. Maria leaned down and kissed the top of his head. Thank you, boy, she whispered. For everything. Cooper wagged his tail, his eyes shining with the unspoken bond they shared. He didn't need words to express his love. It was written in every wag, every lick, every moment they had spent together. As the sun began to set, Maria felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had built something meaningful, something that would continue to make a difference long after she was gone. And it all started with a stray dog who had taught her the true meaning of love, resilience, and hope. She looked down at Cooper and smiled. Come on, boy, she said softly. Let's go home. And as they walked back to the car, side by side, Maria knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and love, just as Cooper had taught her.